I don't think my parents are good people. I've tried not to say that for most of my life. Not out of fear, not even out of love, but out of something colder, habit. You grow up being told that parents deserve respect, that you owe them your voice, your thanks, your restraint. That even when they fail, you don't call it failing. You call it a hard time, a misunderstanding, a generational gap. You call it anything but what it really was. And for a long time, I played along. I sent cards on birthdays, made the phone calls, brought the grandchildren like offerings. I told stories that painted them in softer colors than they ever earned. Because that's what you're supposed to do. You protect the myth. You maintain the family's public face. But the truth is, when I think of them, really think of them, I feel a kind of hollowness I can't cover anymore. Not hate, not even anger, just a deep, persistent knowing that these were not kind people. They were not generous. They were not safe. They were not loving in the way children deserve. And the worst part is, they never thought they needed to be. They thought providing a roof and food was enough. That discipline meant yelling. That silence was strength. And maybe to them, it was. Maybe they never questioned it. But I did, quietly, for years, and now finally out loud. I don't think my parents were good people, and I know exactly what that sentence costs. People expect horror when you say something like that. They wait for the twist, the abuse, the violence, the scandal that makes your judgment feel justified. But there's none of that here. No bruises, no police reports, no dramatic childhood to point at. My parents were ordinary. He worked, she cleaned. They paid bills on time. We went to school with lunches packed and came home to dinner on the table. There were holidays, birthdays, photo albums. From the outside, we looked like everyone else. And that's what makes it harder to name. Because when you grow up in a house where nothing is technically wrong, you start to believe that the problem must be you. That maybe you're too sensitive, too ungrateful, too cold. You learn to smile when you're supposed to say, "I love you," even when it feels like paper in your mouth. You perform the role of the grateful child, the respectful son or daughter, because breaking the illusion feels more dangerous than living inside it. And yet somewhere deep down, the fracture keeps growing. Because kindness has a texture, warmth has a tone, and even as a child I knew we didn't have it. We had control, we had rules, we had a kind of efficiency that looked like stability, but love? That was never in the room, not in the way that lingers, not in the way that teaches you how to be soft without fear. And now, decades later, I see how much of myself was shaped by that absence. Not through trauma, but through the slow erosion of what should have been. That's why it's terrifying to speak it out loud. Not because it's cruel, but because it sounds impossible when everything looked so normal. I played my role well. I was the child they could be proud of on paper. I got the grades, kept my room clean, never raised my voice. I learned early that peace in our house meant silence, and silence was rewarded. So I became what they needed: predictable, polite, accomplished. I came home on time. I didn't ask for too much. I didn't cry where they could hear it, and they would say things like, "You're so easy," like it was praise. I wore it like a badge, not realizing it was a sentence, because being easy wasn't who I was. It was who I became to survive the coldness without causing ripples. They didn't hit me. They didn't scream. They just made everything conditional. Approval was given, but only when earned. Affection arrived in brief, uncomfortable gestures, always feeling like a transaction. I remember once getting a hug after winning some school competition, but it felt more like a press conference than a moment. Their arms didn't hold, they just made contact. And when the cameras, so to speak, were gone, so was the warmth. I learned how to mimic love from TV shows, from other people's families. I watched how parents looked at their children with softness, with a kind of reckless affection that didn't have to be earned. And I realized we didn't have that. We had correctness, we had structure, but love, the real, untidy, instinctive kind, that was absent. And you start to understand something bitter as you get older, that fulfilling your role perfectly doesn't guarantee connection. You can do everything right and still feel unknown, still feel unloved, still feel like a guest in the house you were born into. There's a thought I've carried for years, one I never let form fully because of how wrong it sounded, even in my own head. I don't think they ever actually liked me. Not loved, liked. The way people enjoy the presence of someone, the way they soften when that person walks into the room. With my parents, there was always this sense that I was an obligation they fulfilled with precision, not a person they were curious about. They provided what was required, and in return, they expected compliance. Anything beyond that, feelings, preferences, the small details that make you who you are, felt irrelevant to them. When I tried to share things I cared about, they listened the way people listen to weather reports, polite, detached, waiting for it to end. And over time, I stopped sharing. I stopped offering pieces of myself that would only fall flat at their feet. You learn gradually that it's safer to keep the real parts of you hidden, not because they'll be punished, but because they'll be met with nothing at all. Indifference has a way of hollowing you out more quietly than cruelty. And this is the part I was always afraid to admit. Sometimes I think they preferred the idea of me to the actual me. The version that made them look good. The version that didn't complicate things. The child who fit neatly into the story they wanted to tell about themselves. Everything I truly was, the messy human parts, never seemed to interest them. And that realization, more than anything else, is what made the distance grow. Not as a choice, not as rebellion, just as a quiet adaptation, a way to survive in a house where the lights were on, the meals were cooked, the routines followed, and yet something essential was missing, something you can't name at the time but feel in every room you walk into. It took me years to understand that this too is a kind of absence people aren't supposed to talk about, but it was the truth. And it shaped me more deeply than I ever allowed myself to acknowledge. There's a kind of anger that doesn't look like rage. It's not loud, not explosive. It doesn't break plates or raise voices. It simmers quietly over years beneath the surface of someone who's been taught that speaking against your parents is a form of betrayal. I lived with that kind of anger for a long time, even when I didn't have the words for it. Not because they hurt me in the obvious ways, but because they made me feel invisible in the subtle ones. And every time I tried to name that, to say, this wasn't love, or this wasn't enough, a chorus of voices would rise in my head, not theirs, but society's. They did their best. They stayed together. They weren't abusive. Be grateful. Grateful. That word has haunted me more than any other. Gratitude weaponized as a gag. The expectation that I should be thankful for being raised, fed, educated, and left emotionally untouched. There's this social script, isn't there, where if your parents didn't beat you or abandon you, then you owe them everything. And I followed that script. I played the good child well into adulthood. I invited them over for dinner. I bought thoughtful gifts. I showed up. Always. Even when it exhausted me. Even when I felt myself shrinking in their presence. Because that's what good children do, right? They maintain the connection. They try harder. They keep forgiving, even when no one's asked to be forgiven. But here's the truth no one prepares you for. Forgiveness means nothing if the wound never stops being opened. My parents didn't evolve. They didn't reflect. They didn't even notice the distance. They mistook my compliance for closeness. They thought showing up meant we were fine. But every visit felt like a performance, every conversation, a script. And I began to wonder, who was I even doing this for? Certainly not them. They didn't need my presence. They needed my agreement, my silence, my willingness to pretend everything was okay. But the older I got, the more suffocating that became. Because I wasn't angry for what they did. I was angry for what they never even tried to understand. There was no curiosity about me, no emotional language, no moments of mutual seeing. I was their child, but not someone they ever attempted to know beyond the surface. They knew facts, my birthday, my job, my kids' names, but they didn't know me. And that kind of estrangement, the kind that wears a mask of normalcy, is lonelier than any distance. It's standing in a room with the people who raised you and realizing they never asked the questions that matter, never looked you in the eyes long enough to see past the mask, never wanted to, because doing so would mean acknowledging their own limitations, and they never could. So instead I did what I always did. I smiled, nodded, passed the salad, changed the subject. I made things easy, for them, for everyone, until I couldn't anymore, until the weight of that unspoken grief became too heavy to carry without cracking. I stopped calling as often. I started answering in shorter sentences. I watched the silence grow, and for the first time in my life I didn't rush to fill it. I let it be awkward. I let it echo. And they didn't ask why. They didn't press. Because deep down they didn't want the truth. They wanted the version of me that never questioned them, the version who stayed grateful. But that version, he's gone now. Not out of rebellion, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Because pretending to be loved in the way you needed, when you weren't, eventually starts to unravel something fundamental in you. And I chose, finally, not to keep unraveling. I chose quietly to stop. I've heard people say that you become your parents, that no matter how hard you try to avoid it, something in you carries them forward, their habits, their fears, their silences. And maybe that's true. Maybe we're all just echo chambers of what raised us. But I also think there's a deeper truth no one wants to say out loud. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do is break that inheritance, not continue it, not carry it gently like a family heirloom, but set it down and walk away. That's what I've spent most of my adult life trying to do. And here's the hardest part to admit. I was a better parent than they were. I know that sounds arrogant. I know it sounds bitter, but it's not. It's just a quiet fact I've come to accept. I looked at the way they raised me, the distance, the conditional love, the polite coldness disguised as order, and I chose something else. I leaned in where they leaned away. I asked questions. I apologized when I was wrong. I said, I love you, even when it felt unfamiliar in my mouth. I broke the silence with my own children, because I remembered what it felt like to live inside it. And yet, even with all that, even with the work, the effort, the conscious unlearning, I still carry the residue of what they left in me. I still brace for rejection in moments of closeness. I still over-explain my feelings like I have to justify having them. I still feel a twitch of guilt when I enjoy something they wouldn't approve of. That's what people don't understand about surviving a house that looked fine from the outside but was emotionally sterile on the inside. The scars are quiet. They don't scream, they whisper. They shape the way you breathe in a room, the way you anticipate judgment, the way you constantly prepare for disappointment even when no one's offered it. My children don't know that version of me. Not fully. They know the warm father, the present one, the one who watches their faces when they speak, who shows up not just with his body but with his attention. But they don't know the machinery behind it, the years of rewiring, The conversations I rehearsed in my head before ever saying them out loud, the moments I had to teach myself how to hug without hesitation. Because no one taught me that. My parents never hugged without it being an event, a gesture, a holiday formality. Never just because someone looked tired or sad or small. I had to learn that love isn't something you schedule, it's something you give when someone needs it, not just when it's convenient. And in learning that, I started to see just how deeply my childhood had rearranged my instincts. I don't blame them for everything. That would be too easy, and maybe unfair. But I do hold them accountable for what they refused to see, for the way they wrapped their neglect in normalcy, for the way they made me feel like a burden every time I wanted more than food and shelter. I remember once asking my father what he was like as a child. He shrugged and said, "Like anyone. I grew up." That was it. No story, no reflection, just the end of the conversation. That kind of emotional starvation becomes a blueprint. You learn that intimacy is a risk, that vulnerability is unwelcome, and then you have children and try to give them what you never had. And some days, it feels like trying to cook without knowing what food is supposed to taste like. You second-guess everything. You overcompensate. You ache in places you didn't know existed. And you still wonder if it's enough. That's what they left me with. Not trauma, not drama, but a legacy of distance that I've spent years trying to close, step by step, word by word, hug by awkward, necessary hug. I broke the cycle, but I still carry the weight. And some days, that weight feels heavier than the silence that created it. I used to tell myself I wasn't afraid of them, that I had grown up, moved out, built a life of my own, that the power they once held had faded with time, with distance. But that wasn't true. What I feared wasn't punishment. It was becoming them. Waking up one day and realizing I'd carried their way of living like an invisible infection. Cold without noticing, distant without meaning to be. That was the nightmare. And for a while, I thought I had avoided it. I gave my children everything I didn't have: presence, softness, room to be imperfect. I watched their eyes light up when I entered a room, a look I never gave my own parents. And I thought, this is different. But then they started asking questions, small ones, harmless at first. What were Grandma and Grandpa like when you were my age? Did they play with you like you play with us? And something in me would tighten. Not because I didn't have answers, but because I did. And they were too plain, too empty, too quiet. I'd say they were busy, or it was a different time. I'd smile like I was remembering something sweet, but my chest would feel hollow. Because how do you explain absence? How do you tell a child who feels deeply loved that you grew up never really being seen? I wanted to protect them from that truth, not just from my parents, but from the idea that love can sometimes be more performative than felt. But the more I tried to shield them, the more I realized that silence, even well-intended, was how it all began. That's when the fear shifted. I wasn't afraid of becoming like my parents. I was afraid of passing on their silence under the disguise of healing, of pretending everything was fine just because the house was full of laughter now. Because healing isn't just doing better, it's telling the truth, even when it stings, even when it exposes you. And that's what I started doing, slowly. Not with anger, but with honesty. I told my children things I had never said out loud, that love isn't always instinctive, that some people never learn how to be warm, that being related doesn't mean being close. And they listened, not with judgment, not with pity, just with this quiet seriousness, like they understood that something heavy had been lifted between us. And in those moments I felt both proud and deeply sad. proud that I had broken something open, sad that it had to be broken at all, that the people who raised me never thought to hand me anything other than duty, that they lived and died never knowing who I really was, not because I didn't want to show them, but because they never asked. And maybe that's the most painful kind of fear. Not what they did, not who they were, but what was never even attempted. What was left unspoken for so long that it became normal. I've carried that silence for decades, but not anymore. This is the part where I let it go, not for them, for me, because fear fed on that silence. And I'm tired of feeding it. I don't need this to be forgiven. I'm not asking for understanding. I'm not trying to rewrite the story or set fire to it. I'm just naming it finally, because silence has lived too long in my throat. I don't think my parents were good people. They weren't cruel. They weren't monsters. They were just small in the way they loved, in the way they listened, in the way they handled the responsibility of shaping another human being. And that smallness didn't leave scars you could photograph. It left echoes, the kind that sit in the corners of rooms long after everyone's gone. I've spent most of my life pretending those echoes were nothing, brushing them off like dust, smiling through them. But the older I get, the louder they become. Not angry, just insistent, like a voice saying, "Tell it straight, no more theater, no more pretending." So this is me telling it. I lived in a house where everything looked fine and nothing felt safe. I was raised by people who fulfilled roles, not relationships. And for a long time I thought that meant I had to be better, softer, louder, more present, to prove I hadn't inherited their distance. But now I understand something else. It's not about proving anything. It's about being honest, even when that honesty makes you the villain in someone else's memory, even when it makes people shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Because discomfort is what breaks the cycle, not closure, not reconciliation, just this, one voice saying what wasn't supposed to be said. I don't know how people will remember them. I don't know how they'll remember me. Maybe I'll be called cold, ungrateful, harsh. But I don't feel cold. I feel awake, finally. And if you're still here, still listening, then maybe something in you has stirred too. Maybe you've lived in rooms like mine. Maybe you've smiled through hollowness and called it duty. Maybe you've spent years performing love while wondering if anyone would ever notice the difference. I don't know. I won't pretend to. But I do know this. The truth, once spoken, doesn't vanish. It sits beside you. It changes the shape of silence. And sometimes that's all we get. Not peace, not forgiveness. Just a room that no longer lies to itself. That's where I am now. Not healed, not whole, just real. And it's enough. Not because it fixes the past. It doesn't. But because it finally exists outside of me. Spoken, steady, unapologetic. And if that makes me hard to love, so be it. I've lived through worse than that.